Somewhere on the Amazon River, a poacher who's on his boat seems to be trying to contact for help on the radio. But there's no response from the other side. As he's trying to get the radio to work, the boat suddenly starts rocking, followed by the floorboards getting loose. He rushes up to the top deck, seemingly running away from an unknown creature. Filled with fear and frustration, he commits suicide instead of letting whatever is after him get to him. The scene then opens up in the Ariu Jungle Hotel, where a woman named Terry is busy with her laptop the size of a briefcase. While she's at it, she hears a knock on the door and goes to check out who it is. At the door, she meets anthropologist Professor Kale, someone who'll be joining her on her next project. He shows her a map of where they can get to their target for the project they're working on. Afterward, they start talking, and that's when Terry realizes Kale is looking like a mess. She asks him why he looks that way, and Kale tells her that he had a battle with piranhas. The next morning, Terry meets up with the rest of the film crew members, Danny, her cameraman, and her childhood friend. Following that, she hands a paper to Kale for his approval, and just then, Westridge, the narrator, arrives. There's also the boat skipper, Mateo, the production manager, Dennis, and Dennis's boyfriend, Gary, the sound engineer, all ready for the trip to find and shoot a documentary about the Shirishama, a long-lost indigenous Amazonian tribe. When Mateo gives his call that they're ready to move, Kale asks everyone to test their equipment and be sure they're with their bug spray before signaling Mateo. As the adventure begins, the filming also begins. Westridge narrates how their adventure begins with the crew expected to sail 1,000 miles from the mouth of the Amazon just to find the Shirishamas, one of the last great mysteries of the rainforest, as he calls it. Not long after, it starts raining, but the shooting of the rainforest continues. Not long after that, the crew starts to hear someone scream for help from a boat up front. Danny informs them that there's a man stranded on the boat, so Kale orders Mateo to pull over to the boat. They then help the man into their own boat, but Kale tells him that they can't take him back to shore as they're heading upriver. The man then informs Kale that they can drop him at the next village, as those people can help him fix his boat. He also apologizes for causing them trouble, but Kale tells him it's alright and asks Mateo to keep the boat moving. However, Mateo seems to look at the stranded man in a suspicious manner before heading back to move the boat. The following morning, the stranded man introduces himself as Paul Cerrone from Paraguay. He claims to have studied to become a priest and decided he needed to see the real world, so he ended up in the jungle where he seemed to fit. When the crew asks him what his calling is now, Paul tells them it's snakes. He claims to catch them for zoos and collectors, which is obviously known as poaching, but in any case, Paul denies it's poaching. He asks the crew what they're hunting after, and Kale tells him that they're only creating a documentary on the Shirishamas. Paul seems to know about the tribesmen, so he offers to show them to the tribe as thank you for saving their lives. The next morning, Terry approaches Paul to ask how long it takes until they get to the tribespeople, and Paul tells her it's not far from where they are now. He then starts to narrate a story that he claims it's a Shirishama legend, but Kale disagrees with him, saying it's a different tribe's legend. Paul then assures him that they follow the directions he's giving, as he claims he traps snakes for a living. But Kale tells him that he locates tribes for a living, and so he knows very well what he's doing. He then tells Mateo to take them in his said direction while Terry starts shooting with Westridge and the rest. Paul then interrupts their shoot and tells them to leave him at the next village if they don't trust him. Later at night, Gary and Dennis inform Terry that they're going out to get some forest sounds. Terry then tells them to be careful before they exit the boat. As they leave, the camera shows a very odd expression on Paul's face. I guess he'll be sticking with the crew for a while. Meanwhile, Gary and Dennis are busy shooting the forest sounds, when suddenly, Dennis realizes they're alone. They start making out, but little do they know that something appears to be watching them. Dennis realizes this and tells Gary to be quiet. Almost immediately, the duo is chased by a creature they don't have the time to look at, but Paul shows up with a gun. I just hope it's to save the foolish lovebirds though. Back on the boat, Kale hears a gunshot and quickly grabs a gun. The rest of the crew, who had also heard a gunshot, joins Cale as they proceed to the front. Mateo then shines the light ahead, revealing Gary and Dennis returning with Paul, who's busy dragging along a huge boar. Gary explains to Cale that Paul saved them from being attacked by the boar, and Cale comes up with a smart idea for everyone to remain on the boat at night. I mean, what were Denise and Gary thinking? The next day, the boat gets caught up by something in the water. Cale then offers to handle it while the rest of the crew waits. Cale then gears up and takes a dive to remove the problem. While he's doing that, he seems to get attacked by something that makes him take off his mask and suddenly start struggling to breathe. Denise immediately realizes that something is wrong and starts calling out to the others. Danny and Gary then jump in to go help Cale. Bringing him back to shore, Terry is worried that he's no longer breathing. Mateo then tells her that there's something in Cale's mouth, and upon opening Cale's mouth, they find a huge wasp sitting in there. But Cale is still not breathing, so Paul does an emergency surgical procedure to help Cale breathe. And it works, much to everyone's surprise. Later, after the girls put Cale to bed, Terry tells everyone that he's okay now and that they should get going. But Danny tells them that their radio is bad, so they have no communication. Meanwhile, Paul has removed whatever's holding the boat, and Mateo tells them he can't fix the radio. Paul then suggests that they take Cale to the hospital if they don't want him to die. He then suggests a route for them, which turns out to be the same as the one he suggested the day before. Terry gets suspicious, but Paul tells her he's only concerned about taking Cale to the hospital now, which is pretty much convincing. However, Danny doesn't trust him and whispers to Terry that he hopes she knows what she's doing. But Terry doesn't have a choice, so they're forced to go with Paul's route. After following the route for the rest of the day, the crew encounters a huge wall blocking the rest of the path. Paul then tells them that they have nothing to worry about. He takes out some dynamites and asks Gary to help him set it up. During the setup, Gary realizes that there's something in the water, and he informs Paul about it. Paul then agrees that there's indeed something in the water. After setting up the dynamites, the two return to the boat and watch the walls blow up. Unfortunately, the explosion causes some wood to fall in their direction and knock down the rest of the fuel they have left. And not to mention dozens of baby snakes covering the boat from the explosion. The crew gets creeped out, but Paul tells them they're just babies and starts tossing them back into the water. Westridge accuses Paul of being aware that there were snakes there, but Paul tells him it was but a pleasant surprise. Little do they know that Paul is up to no good, and Terry could feel it in her guts. Later, Paul leads them to an abandoned boat that belongs to the poacher from the start of the movie. He claims it would have fuel. He takes Danny and Mateo with him to search the wreckage. Inside, Paul finds an old newspaper that reveals that he, Mateo, and the poacher were actually working together to catch animals, especially snakes. He grabs the paper and hides the evidence immediately. After searching the boat, Danny and Paul head back to their boat, while Mateo falls into the water and gets attacked by a giant male anaconda, measuring 25 feet. Sadly, the others are unaware of Mateo's ill fate. Danny goes back to find him, but can only find Mateo's torchlight. Paul then breaks it to them that there's an anaconda in the waters, and whatever the case may be, Mateo is long gone now. He then finally reveals to them that he's actually after the anaconda, which he believes could fetch them a lot of money. However, Terry strongly believes that Mateo is still alive and suggests that they leave the boat afloat till morning in case Mateo comes back. That night, Gary is deceived by Paul into believing that they could make a lot of money from catching the anaconda, so he decides to help Paul. Little did he know that foolish actions come with dire consequences. The next day, Paul shoots down a monkey to be used as bait. He then gets into a brief argument with Terry, who stands her ground, saying that they're not catching any anacondas on her boat. That's when Gary turns on them, saying that they could all just cooperate and help film Paul catching the anaconda, which Paul claims would fetch them millions of dollars. Gary also tells them that Paul has promised to get them out of the Amazon alive if they help him catch the snake. Danny thinks they're both crazy and threatens to push them both into the river, but Paul makes an even bigger threat by shooting near Danny as a warning. With that, Paul finally gains control of the boat, forcing everyone to do as he says. That night, Paul attempts to capture the Anaconda using the monkey bait, but the Anaconda attacks the whole crew. Danny gets swept off his feet by the Anaconda, while Westridge narrowly misses death. The snake goes after Terry, but Paul hits it with a tranquilizer, causing the snake to go haywire. This also causes Denise to fall into the water. Gary then jumps in after her to help her. Luckily for them, they both make it back to the boat before the snake can reach them. But that doesn't mean the danger's over. Suddenly, the snake can go around Gary and starts to crush him, much to Denise's dismay. Terry tries to shoot at the snake, but Paul knocks out the gun, saying the snake won't fetch them money if it's dead. The snake is then left to devour Gary, leaving Denise heartbroken and in tears of having lost her lover before her eyes. Seeing as things are now getting out of hand, Terry, Danny, and Westridge put together a plan. Terry approaches Paul and tries to seduce him, so Danny can shoot him. Sadly, Paul catches onto their plan and counterattacks them. What he doesn't know is that Westridge is also part of the plan, and when he lets his guard down, he's hit twice in the back of the head by Westridge, and they successfully overpower Paul. Danny then suggests that they throw him into the river, but Terry has had enough of people dying on her boat. She suggests they tie him up instead. The next day, Terry confronts Paul. She now knows that everything was one big setup, starting from finding Paul on a shipwrecked boat to Mateo and the route to the hospital. Paul then reminds her of the wasp that he has set up for Cal to put him out of commission. Angered by this, Terry punches him. Meanwhile, Westridge is giving Danny boat driving lessons when Terry joins them. The two men then start to anticipate going back to the peace of their homes and away from this Anaconda gibberish. Not long after, they get stuck at a waterfall. Westridge instructs Danny on what to do to get the boat out, but nothing works. So Danny suggests that all three of them go into the water to winch the boat loose. While they're at it, Denise confronts Paul with a knife in an attempt to kill him and get revenge for Gary's death. But she's too slow, and somehow Paul finds a way to strangle her with his legs before dumping her corpse into the water. He then gets hold of the knife and starts using it to cut himself loose. Meanwhile, the Anaconda is back, and it's after Danny and Terry. Westridge then distracts the snake long enough for Terry and Danny to get on the boat. As the Anaconda makes its way for Westridge instead, he swims up to the waterfall. While this is happening, Paul finally cuts himself loose and attacks Danny. Terry tries to help but is knocked over. Paul then stabs Danny in the leg while Terry tries to aim for Paul without shooting Danny. Just then, Westridge is coiled up by the snake atop a tree that falls towards the boat, causing the entire crew to jump into the water. During the commotion, Cal wakes up and goes out to check what the noise is about. Meanwhile, Terry realizes that Westridge was killed during the attack and quickly swims back to the boat. Danny, however, is too slow due to the wound on his leg. Finally reaching the boat, the duo realizes that Denise is also gone. Terry tries to reach out to Danny to help him up, but the snake immediately coils him up. Terry then quickly finds a gun and shoots the snake in the head several times, causing it to let go of Danny. Paul gets infuriated that Terry killed the snake, so he attacks her and puts Danny at gunpoint. But before he can do anything, Cal stabs him in the back with the reptile tranquilizer. He grabs Cal by the neck and squeezes on the wound, but with the tranquilizer overpowering him, Danny takes the opportunity and knocks him into the water. Terry and Danny then help Cal back to bed, and he immediately passes out again. As they continue their journey, Danny and Terry come across an abandoned boat dock. Danny tells Terry that they might find fuel there, so Terry accompanies him to check it out. Unfortunately, they meet Paul, who has managed to catch up to them. He takes them hostage and uses them as bait to catch a much larger female anaconda, about 40 feet. His plan works with the snake coiling around the duo and slowly suffocating them. Paul then tries to capture it using a net, but it breaks free and attacks him. Finally, after everyone, he's sacrificed in the name of catching a giant snake. As the snake swallows, Paul, Terry, and Danny try to escape, but the snake chases after them. Terry finds herself in a building with a nest full of baby anacondas. The snake then catches her there and regurgitates a partially digested Paul before chasing her up the smokestack. Danny, on the other hand, pins the snake down with a pickaxe and tells Terry to climb out through the top while he lights up a fire at the base to blow the whole thing up. The explosion knocks the burning anaconda into the water, while Terry and Danny regroup on the docks. But the anaconda refuses to give up just yet. It resurfaces and tries to attack them again, but Danny finishes it off with an axe on the head. Later, the duo goes back to their boat to meet Cal, who is slowly recovering. As they sail down the river, they finally locate the Shiri Shama tribe that brought them out there in the first place. Terry then asks Danny to grab his camera and get filming. Later, we see the boat sailing out of the Amazon with Danny, Terry, and Cal as the last survivors. And this is the end. This was a recap of the 1997 movie Anaconda by Louis Loza and starring Jennifer Lopez, Ice Cube, Jon Voight, Eric Stoltz, Jonathan Hyde, and Owen Wilson. So, do you think the crew was right to help Paul when he claimed he was stranded? And if you were Gary, would you have chosen to help Paul as he did? Let us know in the comments below with #CinemaRecap. And until next time.